The old house stood silent, a sentinel of forgotten memories. It wasn't the kind of silence that offered peace, but rather one that hummed with untold stories, a stillness so profound it felt like a presence itself. For Arthur Blackwood, inheriting this ancestral home after his mother's sudden passing was less a blessing and more a haunting. He had always known his mother, Eleanor, to be a woman of quiet grace, a pillar of strength who had raised him single-handedly after his father vanished when Arthur was just a toddler. Her life, as he understood it, was a simple tapestry woven with threads of devotion to him, her work as a librarian, and her passion for gardening. There were no grand tales, no dramatic escapades, just a steady, predictable rhythm that had lulled him into a false sense of security about her past. But the house, with its creaking floorboards and shadows that danced in the corners, seemed to whisper that the tapestry was far more intricate, perhaps even stained with hues he couldn't yet comprehend. Arthur, a man of 35, an architect by trade, was methodical by nature. He approached the task of clearing out his mother's belongings with the same precision he applied to blueprints, but even his disciplined mind couldn't prepare him for the emotional weight of each item. Each porcelain figurine, each worn book, each framed photograph was a tangible piece of the woman he thought he knew. He worked through the main rooms, carefully categorizing, discarding, and packing, until only the attic remained. The attic. It had always been a forbidden zone during his childhood, a place shrouded in a mother's gentle but firm no, accompanied by a vague explanation about dust and old things best left undisturbed. He'd never questioned it, not truly, dismissing it as one of his mother's harmless quirks. Now, standing at the foot of the narrow, unlit stairs, a prickle of unease snaked up his spine. The air in the attic was thick with the scent of age, dust, dried wood, and something else, something subtly metallic, like forgotten pennies or dried blood. A single, bare bulb reluctantly flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with every gust of wind against the eaves. Old trunks, covered in faded canvas, lined one wall. Sheets draped over forgotten furniture created ghostly forms. It was a mausoleum of memories, untouched for decades. Arthur began systematically, opening one trunk after another, finding predictable family heirlooms, his grandmother's wedding dress, his grandfather's war medals, yellowed letters from distant relatives. He was almost resigned to finding nothing more than dusty relics of a bygone era, when his hand brushed against something soft, hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets in the very last, most unassuming trunk. It was a small, leather-bound diary, its cover faded and scuffed, secured with a tarnished brass clasp. No lock, no key, just the clasp, as if daring him to open it. A strange tremor ran through him. This was different. This wasn't a family heirloom intended for display. This felt intensely personal, profoundly secret. His mother had been a private woman, yes, but this level of concealment was unsettling. With a deep breath, Arthur undid the clasp. The first few pages were brittle, the ink faint, but the handwriting was unmistakably his mother's. It was a neat, elegant script, but imbued with attention he'd never seen in her casual notes. The dates began decades before his birth, long before she met his father, or at least the man he knew as his father. The entries chronicled a life he knew nothing about, a life filled with names he didn't recognize, places he'd never heard her mention. There was a vibrancy, a desperate yearning in those early pages, a stark contrast to the calm, composed woman he had grown up with. He read for hours, the dim light of the attic bulb doing little to dispel the growing dread in his gut. The entries spoke of a young Eleanor, vibrant and full of dreams, living in a small, coastal town far from where they had settled. She spoke of a passionate, whirlwind romance with a man named Julian. Julian. The name itself felt like a jolt. Arthur had never once heard this name. His father was Thomas. Thomas Blackwood. A quiet, unassuming man whose memory was as hazy as a dream. But this Julian. The diary painted a picture of a love so intense, so consuming, it leapt off the pages. Eleanor wrote of secret meetings, whispered promises under moonlit skies, a love that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. It was clear, even from these early entries, that their love was forbidden, shadowed by something she couldn't articulate, only hint at with cryptic phrases like the arrangement and the consequences of discovery. As he delved deeper, the tone shifted. The passionate yearning began to curdle into fear, a palpable anxiety that bled through the elegant script. Entries became shorter, more fragmented, filled with ellipses and frantic exclamation points. She wrote of hushed conversations, of feeling watched, of a growing sense of entrapment. Then came the entries detailing her pregnancy. Pregnancy, but not with him. The dates confirmed it. This was another child. A child conceived with Julian. The revelation hit Arthur like a physical blow. His mother had had another life, another love, another child, all hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed normalcy. The Eleanor he knew, the one who baked his favorite cookies and helped him with his homework, was a meticulously crafted facade. The realization was sickening, a betrayal not of malice, but of profound, unspoken truth. The diary detailed the agonizing choices, the desperate measures. Julian, it seemed, was embroiled in something dangerous, something that threatened to consume them both. Eleanor wrote of his increasingly desperate attempts to protect her, to provide for their unborn child, but always with a sense of impending doom. There were references to the organization, a shadowy entity that seemed to control Julian's life, and by extension, hers. The love story, once so radiant, became a tragic tale of two souls caught in a web far beyond their control. Then, abruptly, the entries about Julian ceased. No explanation, just a gaping void. In its place, a new, more terrifying narrative began to unfold. Eleanor, alone and terrified, detailing her plans to escape, to protect her unborn child from them. The fear was raw, visceral. She wrote of a forced departure, a desperate flight under the cover of darkness, leaving everything behind, including, it seemed, Julian. The diary entry ended on a chilling note, a declaration of her unwavering resolve to protect her child, no matter the cost. It was a mother's fierce, primal promise, echoing through the dusty silence of the attic, promising a truth that was only just beginning to emerge. The air in the attic, once thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten wood, now felt suffocating, heavy with the unspoken weight of his mother's past. Arthur sat amidst the scattered artifacts of a life he barely recognized, the diary clutched in his hand like a lifeline, or perhaps a ticking bomb. The entries from his mother, Eleanor, after Julian's abrupt disappearance, were a descent into a new kind of terror. Her elegant script, once flowing with youthful dreams, now became a frantic scrawl, punctuated by desperate dashes and urgent underlines. She wrote of constant vigilance, of changing her appearance, of a harrowing journey across states, never staying in one place for long. She was a phantom, existing on the fringes, always looking over her shoulder. The narrative was punctuated by chillingly vague references to them, an omnipresent, unseen threat that pursued her relentlessly. This organization, as she vaguely called it, seemed to be a force of immense power and reach, capable of tracking her every move. Eleanor, the librarian who meticulously organized her life and her books, was now living like a fugitive, her very existence a testament to a desperate fight for survival. She described her growing paranoia, the way every shadow seemed to hide an observer, every unfamiliar face a potential threat. Her diet consisted of whatever she could find. Her sleep was shallow and plagued by nightmares. She was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone, with a life growing inside her that was both her greatest hope and her most vulnerable point. The entries spoke of hunger, of cold, of the kindness of strangers that she couldn't fully trust, and the cruelty of those who preyed on the desperate. It was a stark, brutal portrait of a woman stripped of everything, relying solely on her wits and an unshakable maternal instinct. Then came the entry that made Arthur's blood run cold. She was forced to give birth in a squalid, hidden room, aided only by a sympathetic, elderly woman she had met on her travels. The description was stark, devoid of the sentimental language one might expect. It was a raw, visceral account of pain and fear, culminating in the birth of a baby girl. A daughter. Not him. This was the second revelation that shattered his perception of his mother. Eleanor had a daughter, a full sister to him, whose existence was completely erased from his family history. The diary then detailed her agonizing decision. She knew she couldn't keep the child. The organization was closing in. Her only hope of survival, and by extension the child's, was to separate. She had to give her up. The words were etched with an unbearable grief. A mother's heart tearing itself apart, forced to choose between an almost certain death for both, or the slim hope of life for one. She described leaving the baby, wrapped in a blanket, on the doorstep of a seemingly safe, anonymous orphanage in a small town. The details were sparse, deliberately so, as if to protect the memory from further pain, or perhaps, to protect the child itself from discovery through the diary. But the raw emotion was undeniable. The silent tears, the last touch of a tiny hand, the desperate prayer for a life she couldn't provide. This was Eleanor, the strong, stoic woman, brought to her knees by a world of danger he could only now begin to imagine. The entries that followed were a blur of despair and forced determination. She managed to find passage on a cargo ship, another desperate measure to put as much distance as possible between herself and them. The ocean voyage was a metaphor for her new life, adrift, isolated, and forever marked by what she had lost. It was during this time, somewhere across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, that the tone of the diary subtly shifted again. A flicker of hope, almost imperceptible at first. She wrote of meeting Thomas Blackwood, Arthur's father, the man who had been a ghost in his memory, a blank space he'd rarely questioned. Eleanor's entries about Thomas were guarded at first, cautious. He was kind, dependable, seemingly untouched by the darkness that had consumed her life. He was a stark contrast to Julian, whose fiery passion had led her down a path of danger. Thomas offered stability, a quiet strength, a promise of normalcy. She was still living under an assumed name, carefully constructing a new identity, one far removed from the hunted woman who had given up her child. She never told him about Julian, about the organization, or about the daughter she'd been forced to abandon. It was a secret buried so deep, it had become part of her very being. The diary then documented their slow courtship, their marriage, and then the astonishing entry of her pregnancy with Arthur. There was a sense of profound relief in these pages, a cautious joy. She was building a new life, a safe haven. But even then, the shadows lingered. There were cryptic notes about precautions, about staying hidden, about the constant, underlying fear that her past would inevitably catch up to her. She lived with the knowledge that one day, the truth might unravel, and her carefully constructed world would collapse. The entries about his early childhood were filled with a fierce protectiveness, a love so intense it bordered on desperation. She was determined that Arthur would never know the fear and instability that had defined her youth. Every lullaby, every bedtime story, every comforting hug was imbued with this silent promise. The final entries in the diary were the most chilling. They were written years later, when Arthur was in his early 20s, just starting his career. Eleanor had begun to notice signs, small, almost imperceptible indications that they hadn't forgotten her. A car driving slowly past their quiet suburban home, an unfamiliar face in the grocery store that seemed to linger too long, a subtle shift in the tone of news reports she heard on the radio. Her paranoia, long dormant, resurfaced with a vengeance. She meticulously documented these observations, convinced that the past was finally catching up. She wrote of her growing fear for Arthur, the realization that her existence, her very presence in his life, might be a threat to him. The diary ended abruptly with a final, desperate plea, a warning intended for whoever found it. A warning about the truth, about the danger, and about the lengths she would go to protect her son. The ink was smudged on the last page, as if she had been interrupted, or perhaps, simply couldn't bear to write any more. Arthur stared at the final, haunting words, the chilling implications sinking in. His mother's sudden death, deemed a heart attack by the authorities, suddenly took on a terrifying new meaning. Arthur sat there, In the oppressive silence of the attic, the diary still open in his trembling hands. The revelation of a hidden sister, a first love, and a clandestine organization had shattered the placid image of his mother, Eleanor, leaving behind a mosaic of fear, sacrifice, and unspoken agony. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the gentle woman who had tucked him into bed with the desperate fugitive who had abandoned a child to save her. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were now snapping into place with a horrifying precision. His mother's quiet insistence on certain routines, her aversion to unexpected visitors, her occasional faraway gaze, all of it now made chilling sense. She hadn't been merely private. She had been perpetually on guard, living a shadow life, always preparing for the inevitable. He needed more. The diary, despite its raw honesty, was fragmented, a desperate chronicle of a woman on the run. It hinted at a vast conspiracy, a powerful entity that could erase lives and reshape destinies. What was this organization? What did Julian have to do with it? And most importantly, what had happened to his sister? The urge to find answers became an unyielding force within him. He started meticulously examining his mother's belongings in the attic once more, but this time with new eyes. He was no longer just clearing out a house. He was searching for clues, for whispers of the truth. He found nothing obvious, no hidden compartments, no cryptic maps, just the mundane objects of a seemingly ordinary life. Days blurred into nights as Arthur immersed himself in research, a world away from his architectural blueprints. He scoured old newspaper archives, looking for any mention of unusual events in the coastal town Eleanor had described, any reports of disappearances or strange occurrences around the time she was with Julian. He cross-referenced names, dates, and locations, but the internet, for all its vastness, yielded nothing concrete related to the mysterious organization or Julian's sudden vanishing. It was as if their past had been meticulously scrubbed clean from public record. The silence of the digital world was almost as deafening as the silence of the attic, reinforcing the chilling efficiency of the entity his mother had feared. He then turned his attention to his father, Thomas Blackwood. A vague figure from his earliest memories, Thomas had been a quiet, unassuming man, a civil engineer who worked long hours and died of a sudden aneurysm when Arthur was 7. He'd never questioned the circumstances. Now, a gnawing suspicion began to take root. Could Thomas have been involved? Or was he, like Eleanor, merely a victim, unknowingly entangled in a web of deceit? Arthur delved into his father's old papers, dusty boxes filled with work-related documents, financial records, and correspondence. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the predictable life of a man dedicated to his profession. It almost made him question the diary's veracity, the horrifying narrative it painted. Perhaps his mother had been delusional, her fears a product of an overactive imagination, but the raw emotion in her writing, the consistent details, the meticulously documented paranoia, it felt too real, too visceral to be a fabrication. Just as despair began to set in, a small, inconspicuous detail caught his eye amidst his father's old engineering textbooks. Tucked inside the binding of a worn copy of Structural Dynamics was a single folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter, nor a drawing. It was a photograph, a faded, sepia-toned image of a young man, undeniably Julian. And beside him, smiling radiantly, was a younger Eleanor, her arm linked through his. But there was a third person in the photograph, partially obscured by a thumbprint, a stern-looking man in a dark suit, whose face seemed vaguely familiar. On the back of the photo, in his father's distinctive, neat handwriting, were just 3 words: he knew everything. The realization hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. Thomas, his quiet, unassuming father, knew. He knew about Julian, about the first child, about Eleanor's past. This wasn't just a coincidence, not a chance encounter. His father had been part of this, or at least intimately aware of it. The idea that his entire family life had been built on a foundation of such profound secrets, with his father acting as a silent guardian of those truths, was almost unbearable. It meant his mother had lived a double life, But so had his father, or at least, he had carried the crushing weight of his wife's secret. Arthur's gaze fell on the third figure in the photograph, the stern man. He racked his brain, trying to place the face. And then it clicked. It was a face he'd seen recently in news reports, in political commentary. A powerful, influential senator. A man known for his ruthless ambition and extensive network. Senator Robert Maxwell. The name was a thunderclap in the quiet attic. Maxwell had been a rising star in local politics decades ago, the same period the diary described. Could he be connected to this organization? The pieces, once again, were slotting into place, but this time, they painted a far more sinister picture. Maxwell, a man of such public stature, tied to a shadowy group that hunted down individuals. The implications were horrifying. He knew what he had to do. The diary and the photograph were no longer just personal tragedies. They were evidence. Evidence of a past that refused to stay buried. A conspiracy that had touched his family at its very core. He had to find his sister. He had to uncover the full truth about Julian. And he had to expose the organization and its ties to Senator Maxwell, no matter the danger. The fear was palpable, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was eclipsed by a fierce determination. His mother had lived a life of fear, had made unimaginable sacrifices. He owed it to her, and to the sister he never knew, to bring the truth to light. The silence of the attic no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a challenge, a call to action. The weight of the truth, once a suffocating burden, now felt like a driving force for Arthur. Armed with his mother's diary and the unsettling photograph, he knew he couldn't simply walk away. The image of Senator Robert Maxwell, the stern face from the faded picture, haunted him. A public figure of such stature, entangled in the dark tendrils of an organization that had shattered his mother's life and stolen his sister. It was almost too much to comprehend. But the evidence was undeniable, the connection undeniable. His first step was to discreetly investigate Senator Maxwell's past, searching for any anomalies, any connections that might link him to the shadowy world described in the diary. It was a painstaking process, poring over old campaign finance records, public statements, and obscure regional news articles. He discovered that Maxwell's political ascent had been unusually swift and ruthless. There were whispers, long forgotten by the mainstream media, about questionable dealings in his early career, about rivals who mysteriously disappeared or suffered sudden, career-ending scandals. Nothing concrete, just a pattern of unsettling convenience. Arthur also noted Maxwell's particular interest in the coastal region where Eleanor and Julian had lived. Maxwell had pushed for certain development projects in that area, projects that had, at times, faced significant local opposition before mysteriously gaining approval. It was a flimsy thread, but it was a thread nonetheless. His next, and far more precarious, move was to find his sister. The diary offered scant details, only the name of a town and the description of a small, anonymous orphanage. Arthur knew that after so many decades, the orphanage might no longer exist, or his sister might have been adopted and her records sealed. He hired a discreet private investigator, a former police detective named Elias Vance, known for his relentless pursuit of cold cases and his uncanny ability to find the unfindable. Arthur revealed only what was absolutely necessary, enough to convey the desperate urgency of his search, but holding back the full, shocking truth of the organization and Maxwell's potential involvement. Vance, a grizzled man with world-weary eyes, listened patiently, his skepticism slowly giving way to a flicker of intrigue. Weeks turned into months. The private investigator's reports trickled in, a slow, agonizing drip of information. The orphanage Eleanor described had indeed closed down decades ago, its records either lost or deliberately destroyed in a fire that was deemed accidental. Another dead end, another wave of despair. Arthur felt the walls closing in, the weight of his mother's secrets threatening to crush him. He was close to giving up, convinced that the past was too well buried, too thoroughly erased. But then, a single grainy photograph arrived from Vance. A woman in her late 50s, with striking eyes that were undeniably Eleanor's. Her name was Clara Jenkins, and she had been adopted from a small, regional orphanage exactly 65 years ago, the orphanage where Eleanor had left her child. The moment Arthur saw the photo, a fierce, primal connection ignited within him. This was her, his sister, Clara. She lived in a quiet, unassuming town just a few hours' drive away. His heart pounded with a mix of overwhelming joy and profound apprehension. How could he possibly approach her? What would he say? "Hello, I'm your brother. And our mother was a fugitive from a secret organization that might have killed her. And our father knew about it, and you were abandoned to save your life?" The truth was too heavy, too unbelievable. He chose to approach her carefully, sending an anonymous letter first, simply stating that he had information about her biological family and wished to speak with her. It was a risk, a desperate measure, but he couldn't just appear on her doorstep. Clara, understandably wary, initially dismissed the letter. But something in the sincerity of the anonymous note, perhaps a flicker of an old, unanswered question about her own past, prompted her to respond through a PI mailbox. A series of cautious, anonymous exchanges followed, slowly building a fragile bridge of trust. Finally, after weeks of back and forth, Clara agreed to meet. The meeting took place in a neutral, public park, a place designed for peace and innocence, a stark contrast to the dramatic revelations Arthur was about to unleash. Clara was a woman of quiet strength, her features bearing an undeniable resemblance to Eleanor, a painful echo of the mother they had both lost, in different ways. Arthur, with a racing heart, laid out the story, piece by agonizing piece, starting with the diary, showing her the faded photograph of Julian and Eleanor, and finally the one with Maxwell. He spoke of their mother's desperate flight, Julian's mysterious disappearance, the existence of the organization, and her abandonment to protect her. He watched Clara's face as the truth unfolded: disbelief, then shock, then a profound, heartbreaking grief. She listened in stunned silence, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. When he finally spoke of Senator Maxwell and his father's hidden knowledge, a new emotion crossed Clara's face. Anger, cold, simmering rage. She revealed something that sent shivers down Arthur's spine. Clara, too, had experienced inexplicable strange occurrences throughout her life. Anonymous threats, strange accidents, the feeling of being watched. She had always dismissed them as coincidences or her own imagination. But now, in the light of Arthur's revelations, it all coalesced into a terrifying pattern. The organization hadn't forgotten her either. They had been watching her, subtly, silently, for decades. With Clara now a witness, and her own experiences corroborating the diary's chilling narrative, Arthur knew their combined strength could be formidable. They decided to expose Maxwell, to reveal the truth about the organization that had tormented their family for generations. They went to a trusted journalist, a woman known for her integrity and fearless investigative reporting. It was a long, arduous process. Maxwell was a powerful man, his connections deep, his influence far-reaching. But armed with Eleanor's diary, the photographic evidence, Clara's testimony, and Elias Vance's meticulous corroboration of the orphanage fire and Maxwell's suspicious activities, the journalist began to uncover the layers of deceit. The story broke like a thunderclap, shaking the foundations of the political establishment. Senator Maxwell, exposed for his involvement in a shadowy clandestine group that had eliminated rivals and silenced dissenters for decades, found his career and his reputation in ruins. The organization, once hidden in the shadows, was forced into the light, its horrific practices brought to public scrutiny. There were arrests, investigations, and a wave of revelations that rocked the nation. Arthur and Clara, once strangers, now bound by a shared, traumatic past, found solace in each other. They visited their mother's grave, finally able to lay the true story of her life to rest, a life of unimaginable bravery and sacrifice. The attic, once a place of fear and mystery, became a testament to her strength, a place where truth had finally come to light. The journey was far from over. The scars would always remain, but they had found each other, and in doing so, had honored their mother's legacy in the most profound way possible. By uncovering the truth she fought so desperately to protect. What secrets lie hidden in your own family history, waiting to be uncovered? Do you think the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth pursuing? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you found this story as compelling as I did. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible true tales, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to light.